Imagine a city that disappeared underwater in a single night. Not metaphorically, literally. 80% of a major American city ended up underwater, with some neighborhoods submerged nearly 6 meters deep, deep enough to cover the roof of a single-story house. People sat on their rooftops for days under a scorching sun, hacking holes through their attics with axes so they wouldn't drown trapped inside their own homes, waiting for rescue, while the entire world watched it happen live and struggled to believe this was even possible in the richest country on the planet. This isn't a disaster movie script. This is August 2005, New Orleans, Louisiana. A hurricane named Katrina. But the real story of this city didn't begin when the water receded. It began exactly when the cameras had already packed up and the world's attention had moved on to something else. Because what happened to New Orleans over the next 20 years is a story about race, money, power, corruption, and about who really gets to decide which city deserves to come back to life, and whose neighborhoods can simply be written off. Today we'll walk through this whole journey, from an engineering catastrophe that killed nearly 2,000 people, through scandals that are still quietly swept under the rug, to the present day, where despite billions of dollars invested, the city still hasn't recovered even half of the population it lost. Stay until the end. We'll talk about whether it even makes sense to rebuild a city that sits below sea level as the climate keeps changing. To understand the scale of the catastrophe, you first need to understand the city itself. New Orleans is arguably the most geographically doomed major city in the United States. A large portion of its built-up area sits below sea level, in some places by several meters. Essentially, the city is a giant bowl surrounded by water on every side. The Mississippi River on one side, the massive Lake Pontchartrain on the other, and the Gulf of Mexico nearby. The city literally stays afloat thanks to a system of levees, flood walls, gates, and pumping stations that has been built and rebuilt for over a century. Before 2005, New Orleans had a population of roughly 455,000 to 460,000 people. It was a city of jazz, Creole and Cajun cuisine, Mardi Gras, deep African-American cultural heritage, second-line parades, and brass bands playing at funerals. But at the same time, it was a city with one of the highest poverty rates among major American cities. More than a quarter of residents lived below the poverty line, and racial segregation by neighborhood was among the starkest in the country. This detail is critically important. Historically, the poorest, predominantly African-American neighborhoods were built precisely on the lowest, most flood-prone land, while wealthier, mostly white neighborhoods sat on natural high ground along the river's old path. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of decades of housing and racial policy. And when the water came, it struck that inequality quite literally. On top of that, in poorer neighborhoods, a large share of households didn't own a car. By some estimates, this applied to nearly a third of residents in the lower Ninth Ward. So when officials say everyone could have just left, for tens of thousands of people that was, technically, not true. On August 23, 2005, a tropical storm, the 12th of that season, formed over the Bahamas. Within days, moving over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it rapidly intensified, and by August 28th, it had reached Category 5, the highest level on the Saffir-Simpson scale, with sustained winds over 280 kilometers per hour. That same day, August 28th, less than 24 hours before landfall, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin finally issued a mandatory evacuation order, the first in the city's history. But ordering an evacuation and actually delivering one are two very different things. The promised bus service for people without their own transportation was organized late and in insufficient numbers. Hundreds of school and municipal buses simply sat in flooded parking lots instead of carrying people out. It later emerged there had simply been no clear plan for who was supposed to drive them. For those who physically couldn't leave, the elderly, the sick, poor families without cars, officials opened a shelter of last resort at the Superdome. Roughly 20,000 to 26,000 people came there. Security at the entrance searched belongings and banned weapons and alcohol, but almost nobody had prepared the site for a multi-day stay by tens of thousands of people. Food, water, and medical supplies lasted only a few days at most. On August 29, 2005, at around 6:10 a.m. local time, Katrina made landfall near the Louisiana-Mississippi border. Here's the key paradox of this disaster. The hurricane itself passed somewhat to the side of downtown New Orleans, and the direct wind damage, while serious, would not on its own have caused a catastrophe of this scale. The real tragedy began a few hours after the storm had already passed the city. The storm's surge, the wall of water a hurricane pushes ahead of it, created pressure that the aging system of protective structures couldn't withstand. More than 50 separate sections of levees and floodwalls around the city breached or failed outright, including three key structures: the 17th Street Canal, the Industrial Canal, and the London Avenue Canal. Water poured into the city not gradually, but suddenly, almost like a tsunami within the urban landscape. In some neighborhoods, the water rose several meters in a matter of minutes. The Lower Ninth Ward, one of the city's poorest and predominantly African American neighborhoods, located right next to the Industrial Canal, was hit hardest. The force of the water literally tore houses off their foundations and carried them down the streets. A later, extensive investigation by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the very federal agency that had been responsible for building and maintaining the levees for decades, officially concluded that the disaster was caused not only by the force of nature, but by systemic engineering failures, outdated designs, and years of underfunded maintenance of the protective structures. In other words, this was, to a significant degree, a man-made catastrophe rather than a purely natural one. In total, up to 80% of the city's territory ended up underwater. Tens of thousands of people were trapped on rooftops, in attics, and inside flooded homes, some without food or fresh water for several days. The following week became one of the most shameful episodes of disaster response in modern U.S. history. The Superdome, designed for a short-term stay by a few thousand people, ended up holding tens of thousands. Power and air conditioning went out within the first few hours, the sewage system failed, and food and water ran out within a day or two. People sat for weeks in unbearable heat amid filth. The stench was so overwhelming that journalists who entered described wearing protective masks. It was even worse at the New Orleans Convention Center, where several thousand more people spontaneously gathered, with no official plan, no food supplies, and virtually no security presence. For several days, this site was effectively not controlled by any authority at all, and it was from there that the most alarming reports of chaos and desperation emerged. Few people remember another episode from those days: the Orleans Parish Prison. When the flooding began, prison staff largely abandoned the building, leaving hundreds of inmates locked in their cells with no lights, no food, and at times standing in water up to their waists for several days. Human rights organizations later called this one of the most overlooked human rights violations of the entire disaster. There was also another dark episode, the so-called Danziger Bridge shooting. A few days after the storm hit, New Orleans police officers opened fire on a group of unarmed civilians crossing a bridge in search of food and help. 2 people were killed and several were wounded. Years later, several officers were convicted of falsifying testimony and covering up the circumstances of the case, and the trial became a symbol of just how deep the crisis of trust ran between residents of the poorest neighborhoods and the city's law enforcement system. Meanwhile, rescue helicopters plucked people from rooftops, and the Coast Guard carried out one of the largest rescue operations in the country's history. It was Coast Guard crews, firefighters, and ordinary volunteers in private boats who saved far more people than the official agencies tasked with doing so. Meanwhile, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which was supposed to coordinate the entire response, turned out to be completely unprepared for the scale of what was happening. The agency's director publicly admitted to Congress that even days after the storm hit, he did not have a full picture of the situation in the city, despite round-the-clock television coverage from the scene. In total, the hurricane and its aftermath killed at least 1,833 people, and more than 1 million people were forced to leave their homes. One of the largest internal population displacements in U.S. history since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Katrina exposed something America preferred not to say out loud. The disaster did not hit everyone equally. The poorest neighborhoods suffered the most. And, as already noted, this was no coincidence, but a direct result of decades of housing segregation. The overwhelming majority of people who died or lost their homes were African American residents who had lived for years in the lowest-lying, highest-risk parts of the city. Footage of people waiting for help on rooftops for weeks in the poorest African American neighborhood of a major American city shocked not just the U.S. but the entire world and sparked one of the fiercest national conversations about race, poverty, and inequality in decades. Public figures, journalists, and even some politicians stated plainly that if the affected area had been predominantly white and affluent, the government's response would have been far faster. President George W. Bush was criticized for years afterward over the slow and inadequate federal response, and the photograph of him surveying the devastated city through an airplane window instead of landing in person became one of the defining images of his entire presidency. When the water finally receded, which in some neighborhoods took over a month, New Orleans had effectively ceased to exist as a living city. By the end of the first week of September 2005, a city that had recently been home to nearly 500,000 people had only a few thousand left. Entire blocks stood empty, houses with collapsed roofs, cars swept up into trees, buildings marked with the now infamous spray-painted X symbols left by search and rescue teams, recording the date of inspection, the responding team, and the number of bodies found inside. The people who were evacuated ended up scattered across the entire country, above all in Houston, but also in Atlanta, Memphis, Baton Rouge, and dozens of other cities. Many of them never returned. Not because they didn't want to, but because there was nothing to come back to. Homes destroyed beyond repair, no jobs, schools closed, and insurance payouts that were often minimal, delayed for years, or never arrived at all. Caught up in disputes over whether the damage was caused by wind, covered by standard insurance, or flooding, which required a separate, far more expensive policy. Behind every number in this story are actual human lives, so it's worth pausing on a typical composite example that reflects the fate of thousands of families. Picture a 3-generation family that had lived for decades in the lower Ninth Ward, in a house the grandfather had built back in the 1960s. They had no car, so when the evacuation order came, they stayed behind. The grandmother was too frail to stand for hours in line for a bus that, in any case, never showed up. They survived the night in the attic, hacking a hole through the roof with an axe they'd kept in the closet just in case. Advice that older Louisiana residents had been passing down to one another since previous hurricanes. A rescue boat picked them up on the third day. They spent the following weeks in a shelter in another state, with no information about what had happened to their neighbors. When they were finally allowed back to see their house, only the foundation remained. The rest had been swept away by the current several blocks down. The insurance company refused to pay full compensation, claiming the damage was caused by water rather than wind, a bureaucratic distinction that meant nothing to a family that had lost everything. The Road Home program offered them a payout calculated on their house's pre-storm market value, which had historically been much lower than the value of a comparable house in a wealthier part of the city, despite identical square footage and identical damage. That money didn't cover even half the real cost of rebuilding. The family's grown children stayed on in Houston, where they had been evacuated. They found jobs there, enrolled their kids in new schools, and after a few years, going home no longer felt like an option, just a memory. The grandmother never adjusted to the new city and, until the end of her life, wished for just one thing: to hear a brass band play again one morning outside her old house in New Orleans. This is a generalized, typical scenario that repeated itself in thousands of variations across the city, which is exactly why the statistic, the population never recovered, actually conceals tens of thousands of personal tragedies just like this one. The years that followed became a period of slow, uneven, and deeply controversial rebuilding. The state of Louisiana launched a massive federally funded homeowner assistance program called Road Home, backed by billions of dollars. But it quickly became clear that payouts were calculated not based on the actual cost of rebuilding a house, but on its pre-storm market value. And since homes in poorer African American neighborhoods had historically been valued far lower than comparable homes in wealthier white neighborhoods, even with identical square footage and identical damage, homeowners in poorer areas received payouts that were a fraction of what wealthier homeowners received. Civil rights organizations later successfully argued in court that this formula was discriminatory. There was also a high-profile story from the opposite direction. Hollywood actor Brad Pitt founded a charitable project called Make It Right to build modern, energy-efficient homes for residents who had lost their houses in the lower Ninth Ward. The project received enormous positive attention at launch, but within a few years, dozens of the newly built homes began falling apart due to construction defects, rotting wood, roof problems, foundation issues. Some homes had to be demolished, and the foundation itself faced lawsuits from homeowners. It became a bitter example of how even well-intentioned, well-funded initiatives can fail without proper quality oversight. Downtown, the French Quarter, and tourist areas recovered relatively quickly. That's where tourism money circulated, and tourism underpinned a large share of the city's economy. But poorer, predominantly African American neighborhoods recovered far more slowly. The lower Ninth Ward, the main symbol of Katrina's devastation, remains partly empty to this day. Entire blocks where houses once stood are now simply overgrown with grass, and by various estimates, the neighborhood has recovered only about a third of its pre-storm population. At the same time, a process began that researchers later called disaster-driven gentrification. Because so many longtime Black residents never returned, new, often wealthier and white, residents began moving into the city, drawn by real estate that was cheap at the time and by federal rebuilding investment. Housing prices in some neighborhoods rose several times over in the years that followed. The old public housing system was, in many cases, demolished and replaced with mixed-income housing. For some, this was a genuine improvement in living conditions. For others, it meant the permanent loss of their home and a community built over decades. The city's school system underwent what is arguably the most radical transformation of any American city. Nearly all public schools were handed over to independent charter school operators, a nationwide unique experiment. Supporters say it raised the city's average academic performance. Critics point out that the process came with the mass firing of thousands of teachers, most of them African American, and dismantled local school communities built up over decades. After Katrina, the federal government invested more than $14 billion in building an entirely new storm surge protection system, stronger levees, new floodgates and barriers, and the world's largest pumping station at the entrance to Lake Pontchartrain. This system became informally known as the Great Wall, protecting New Orleans. Its real test came with Hurricane Ida in August 2021, a storm of nearly the same strength, which struck the city exactly 16 years after Katrina. This time, the new levee system held. Large-scale flooding of the city's core neighborhoods was avoided. It stood as strong evidence that the billions invested in rebuilding the infrastructure had actually paid off. Still, Ida caused serious damage. The hurricane knocked out power across the entire city for several days due to damaged transmission lines, and dozens of people died of carbon monoxide poisoning from generators run indoors without ventilation as residents tried to escape the summer heat without air conditioning. In other words, the levee system no longer fails, but the city's vulnerability now shows up in other ways. More than 20 years have now passed. Where does the city actually stand? The city's population has still not returned to pre-storm levels. If New Orleans was home to roughly 455,000 to 460,000 people before Katrina, by the mid-2020s that figure stood at approximately 355,000 to 380,000, meaning the city is still missing at least 100,000 residents. Population peaked after the disaster in 2018, when the city counted around 392,000 residents. But after the coronavirus pandemic, that number began slowly declining again. The steepest population decline occurred specifically among African American residents, the group that had formed the city's cultural core before the disaster. At the same time, the Hispanic community grew significantly. The Hispanic share of the population rose from roughly 3% to 8%, driven largely by construction workers and laborers who came for the rebuilding effort and ended up staying in the city permanently. Employment also hasn't fully recovered. Before the storm, about 186,000 people worked in the city. Today, it's roughly 169,000. In other words, despite 20 years and billions of dollars invested in rebuilding, the city's economy still hasn't reached its pre-storm level. Meanwhile, crime and inequality statistics remain among the harshest in the country. The poverty rate in the city still significantly exceeds the national average, and median household income varies sharply depending on neighborhood and race. These numbers aren't abstractions. They're a direct continuation of the very same inequality that determined who suffered the most from Katrina 20 years ago. As for storm protection itself, despite a new, far more powerful levee system, the long-term problem hasn't gone away. Louisiana's coastline loses significant land area every year to erosion, rising sea levels, and the shrinking of natural wetland buffers that used to soften the blow of storms. So even the most advanced engineering system protects the city from today's threats. But the question of whether a major city below sea level can be sustained long-term amid climate change remains open for scientists and residents alike. And yet, there's something the hurricane couldn't destroy. The jazz clubs of the French Quarter play every night again. Mardi Gras still draws millions of visitors from around the world every year. The Mardi Gras Indians, communities of African American residents who spend years hand-sewing elaborate carnival costumes with feathers and beadwork, carry on a tradition more than a century old. Second-line funeral parades with brass bands, local cuisine, and rituals of neighborly mutual aid, all of it survived, even if not always in the same form or in the same neighborhoods where it once existed. New Orleans taught America a harsh lesson. A disaster is never simply natural. Who suffers the most, who gets help first, and who waits for weeks or years. All of that is determined long before a storm ever arrives. By infrastructure, poverty, racial inequality, and political decisions made decades earlier. Katrina killed nearly 2,000 people, destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, and permanently changed the face of one of America's most iconic cities. But the real story here isn't only about destruction. It's about what happens after the cameras leave. Who gets the chance to return and rebuild, and who simply gets written off and forgotten. New Orleans is alive. The jazz still plays, the parades still take to the streets. But it's no longer quite the same city it was before August 29, 2005, and it may never fully be that city again. If this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which other disaster or city you'd like to see covered next.